These families, one of the very important characteristics of all is the fruit type. Because oftentimes the fruit type can be distinctive, it can help you distinguish between the different groups. And even within families, you can find some variability. So for example, in the Rosaceae family, we look at some of the subfamilies, and they're going to have different fruit types. One's going to have cone, one's going to have drupe, one's going to have aggregate. So you can use those to help you with this. So make sure you know the fruit types for all of them. And for the water lily family, it was this weird kind of capsule that doesn't dehisce as regularly as you expect a capsule to. Usually there are specific suture lines or pores or things like that pop open. This one kind of pops open on whatever side happens to be weakest. And I've actually got an example of one of these types of capsules that came from one of the native ones I introduced you to, which is the spatter dot from around Rosefoot Lake. So I'm going to pass around so you get a chance to see kind of what that looks like when it's kind of an intact form. And then we moved on into the next family, which was Lauraceae, which was our laurel family, which I told you is going to be something woody. You're not going to have herbaceous things in this family unless it's someplace out of the region here. Everything around here is going to be either shrub or tree. Many of them have aromatic oils in their leaves, which means that when you crush them, there's a pleasant scent that comes with it. We talked about the leaves. They're typically simple. They usually are undivided or lobed. Sassafras is weird because it has kind of all those combinations on the same tree. You've got some lobes, got some that are entire. Simple leaves though, most of them are evergreen, but sassafras is not, so there are some exceptions. And we talked about the flowers. They can be bisexual or they can be unisexual, very small, oftentimes yellow, and actinomorphic, and those are tepals that you're looking at there. So the sepals and the petals look the same. That's another good one to kind of know for some of the families is which families have tepals and which ones have differentiated petals and sepals, because that will also help for identification. One of the types of questions that's really common on tests and quizzes relating to the angiosperm families are descriptions that go along with pictures that you have to identify what the family is, right? So, and I try and give you key characteristics in there, multiple if I'm doing a description, I give you multiple characteristics, but there's something in there that you definitely should know, and it should kind of give away as to what that family is. So really focus on those bolded terms, on those bolded characteristics, the underlined ones, and look at the pictures. Because if you get a picture and you have that kind of ingrained in your mind, it may help you if I've got a picture that looks very similar to that in the test as well. So be expecting those types of matching questions if you're matching your families to descriptions or names or pictures. And we also talked about how their anthers have this unique feature that they have these little flaps that kind of open up and release the pollen. They may have 2 of them, like you can see on these, or they may have 4, where there's 2 bigger ones down here, 2 smaller ones on the top, but it's kind of distinctive. And you can definitely see it under the microscope. It's one of the ways I help students identify sassafras when they collect it, because you're really only going to get the flowers, because they flower before the leaves come out. The gynoecium, kind of indescript, 1 carpel, superior ovary, and then the fruit type was either a berry or a drupe. Then we got into some of the native species, which included our sassafras and our spice bush. This is obviously a shrub species, and when you crush the leaves, it has a nice kind of peppery, sweet smell to it. I love the smell of the spice bush. Sassafras smells like Fruit Loops or Fruity Pebbles, as some people would like. And then we got into our economically important ones. And I told you for the families that we're discussing, if I give you an economically important plant, I do want you to know that one. You don't have to know the native Tennessee ones. That's to help you with your collection in case you run across those. These I want you to know. So we've got our bay tree. That is the source of bay leaves that we use in culinary stews, things like that. So that comes from the Laurus nobilis, which is the bay laurel. You have your avocado, that's in this family as well. Obviously a drupe, because it's got the pit on the inside. So you don't have to know the scientific names. Common names are fine. So avocado, bay laurel, those are fine. And I was just getting into one of the most important ones in this family, and that's cinnamon. So this one is extremely valuable. It is one of the oldest that you'll see records of. And you can actually find accounts of people using cinnamon back in ancient Egypt. You can find it in the Bible. You can find it in Greek and Roman and Chinese accounts. A lot of different references to this, and it was considered a very valuable type of spice. It's native to India and Sri Lanka because it tends to like wet tropical climates. That's where it grows the best. And the part that you're actually eating when you eat cinnamon is the inner bark layer, not the outer bark layer, but the inner bark layer. So I'm going to kind of show you how they harvest this and they make this. Cinnamon's fun, but you gotta smell it. You'd be surprised the number of people that smell cinnamon. Myself, I can't. Cinnamon is just, yeah. I can't forget it smelling. And cinnamon's actually a desiccant foam. You didn't know that, so it's one of those things that actually absorbs water, which is why it's hard to swallow. And no, don't try and swallow a spoonful. That's the solution.
That was a trick.
I know it was.
Did you teach this class when it was a trick?
I did. I was scared to death when my teacher was trying try and do that. You're gonna try and swallow your own.
Because like the gas
It's gonna get into a lot of dangerous.
Why do people
I
I didn't know people would cough like crazy and then they like spit it out.
Because it just takes all that water away, just absorbs all of it. It's just, it's the liquid. Okay, so here's how you make it. Cinnamon is actually harvested by first growing the trees for about 2 years, and then you do something called coppicing, which means you cut off the main trunk here so that you get a bunch of side shoots. And that's the whole point. You want as many of these shoots as possible because that's what you're gonna harvest, and that's what you're actually gonna collect the bark from. So once you get these smaller shoots that you see right here, once they get big enough that you can actually harvest them, they'll take them off. They'll process it by removing all of the bark with a special curved knife that you can see right here. And then they scrape away the outer layers of the bark, because really all they want is that inner layer. And when it first comes off, it's kind of flat, kind of looks like a scroll a little bit, but when it starts to dry, it will actually curl up into these things that they call quills, and that's the cinnamon stick. Okay, so and then when people get it in ground form, they just take these cinnamon sticks and they basically ground those up. And you can actually grind one of those on your food if you don't want to actually buy the ground cinnamon as well. So you're actually eating part of the bark when you make the cinnamon. And that's in the Lauraceae family. Very important one too. All right, now the next family we're going to go into, hopefully we're a little bit familiar with it because we can kind of look at some of the stuff in lab. We're getting into the Magnoliaceae family, which is the Magnolia family. Thankfully, the common name matches the scientific name, which is super handy. This one is going to be also trees and shrubs, so if you're looking at an herb, it's probably not in this family. Want something woody here. And some of these also will have aromatic oils in their leaves. So I think I mentioned before that there is a sweet bay tree, and I know bay is kind of confusing because it sounds like it should be in the Lauraceae family, but it's not. Sweet bay is actually in the Magnolia family. There are some sweet bays that were growing in front of the library. So if you go on the main door, if you go kind of over where the steps start off the porch area, there's some sweet bays that are actually planted there that are in this family. They have glaucous leaves on the bottom side, so there's a waxy layer on the bottom side, which you can actually melt with a lighter. It actually melts the wax. But if you crush those leaves, they're going to smell really sweet. They smell wonderful. And they're actually in this family, not in the Lauraceae family. The other things to know about the leaves, they're simple. They are alternate. You can have some lobing, you can have some entire margins, you can have some differences there on the leaves, but one of the things that they do have is they have stipules, and I've got underlined, bolded, all sorts of things related to this because this one's kind of an important characteristic. So the stipules are big. They don't last very long, but they're big when they are first there. And this is actually showing you what it looks like on tulip poplars, because yes, tulip poplars are in this family. So these big kind of ear-shaped things that you see right here that look like leaves are actually the stipules. And remember, there's always two at the base of the leaf. So there's our leaf coming down right there, so it's attaching. So it's got two on either side of it for that leaf right there. And they completely wrap around the entire stem and they close the bud. So here's where the leaf would have been attached right here. Here's where the stipules would have been attached. You'd have one here, you'd have another one on the other side that would actually wrap around that bud and you wouldn't be able to see it. But they fall off very early. So as soon as the tulip poplars are starting to leaf out, you're going to see these obvious stipules on them, but they're going to go away pretty quickly, and you're going to find all these green things on the ground. That's what they are. When they do fall off, they leave a scar, just like the leaf leaves a scar when it falls off. It looks like this. The stipules in this case leave a scar as well. And because they did encircle and wrap all the way around the stem, it leaves a ring around the entire stem. That is a really good way to recognize this family, because it doesn't even have to have any leaves on it, and you can still see the rings around the scars. So let me show you and kind of walk around, let you see what I'm looking at here. Look, every place place that there's a leaf scar, and you're gonna see a ring all the way around the stem. Bless you. There's a leaf scar. Leaf scars?
I didn't even hear you.
Everybody else did.
Leaf scar? That's a leaf scar.
And then people stick here.
Those are big sticky scars.
They needed another relax.
For school.
Plants are super awesome.
Cool.
This one's from our southern magnolia acacia.
What? What did I say? That was in the past.
That's in the past.
It's in the past.
Or like, hey, remember that guy? That guy's in,
They'll probably just be like, remember that guy named Jake?
yeah, he's something.
He's up with a guy in the coveralls.
Alright.
They were on obstacle course together. I said they were on obstacle course together.
Okay. Now, flowers will be solitary, so you're not looking for seam spikes or things like that, just solitary flowers. More than one on the tree, but every place there's a flower, there's just one sitting there. They can be pretty big. So, for example, the elephant or umbrella tree is gonna have a flower that's almost this big. And the southern magnolias are about that big, so they can get pretty good size. And they're usually perfect, so they're bisexual. They have male and female reproductive parts, both functional on the same flower. And they're actinomorphic. So they have radial symmetry. Plus an elongated receptacle. So you remember how we keep showing these pictures in lab about these flowers that have these kind of cone-shaped receptacles that all the carpels are kind of sitting around the edge like we saw for the strawberry, for the blackberry. The same thing applies here. It's gonna look a little different, but the same thing applies here. So this whole thing, this skinny portion here, this funnel-shaped part here, all the way going up into this region right here, all of that is the receptacle. Matter of fact, for the tulip poplar, some people call it tulip tree, but the tulip tree will actually have one that's essentially spike-shaped. And when all the seeds fall off, or all the fruits fall off, it actually looks like a spike that's left on the tree. So that's the receptacle. And we're gonna come back to how things are arranged on that in shortly. Other things to know about the flowers, they have 6 to many tepals. Color is variable, although yellow and white's pretty common around here. And they also have laminar stamen. So we learned about laminar stamen last week, or last class period. It's when you have stamen that don't look like normal stamen, they look more flattened and petal-like. And sometimes it's kind of hard to distinguish where the filament is versus the anther, but many times it just essentially looks like a petal that has these pollen sacs on the top of it. Now in the case of the water lilies, which is the other one we talked about with this, you had a situation where the further out in the flower you were, the more they looked like petals, and the further in the flower you went to, the more they looked like stamen, regular stamen. So there was this kind of gradation, and they changed in appearance. These don't do that. They all look the same. Okay? They're all going to have that same size and shape, but they're still flattened and petal-like. And they have the anther sacs on the top of them as well. So they're still considered laminar stamen, they just don't grade into different appearances. And they will be spirally arranged on the lower portion of the receptacle. So this part down here, as you can see, some of them have fallen off, and I'm going to show you what it looks like when they do fall off. This portion right here has already had those stamen fall off. These are the ones that are left. These will eventually fall off as well when this starts to go into fruit. And you'll be able to see the scars that are left over and left behind from those. Then we have our female parts, the gynecium, where you've got lots and lots of unfused carpels. So in some ways it is very similar to what we saw in the raspberries and the strawberries, because they had these separate carpels that all kind of went around this elongated receptacle. The same thing applies here. So that's what these are right here. These are all our separate carpels, and you can see them right here positioned, and they are spirally arranged on the receptacle as well. It's just that they are on the top portions, and the stamen are down here on the bottom portions. So from here up, it's stamen, and then from there up, you have your carpels. The styles are oftentimes recurved, which means they kind of curve this way. You can see they look kind of C-shaped, or like little hooks. And in many cases, the stigmatic region, the part that's actually sticky, that catches the pollen, is only on one side of that. So this portion right here. And these right here would be considered superior ovaries. Why? Because all the other parts are attaching below where they're sitting. They are way up here on the top of the receptacle. Your stamen are way down here, and your petals and your sepals are attaching way down here. So everything's attaching below where the ovaries are. So they are considered superior ovaries. Sometimes it's hard to tell that when you've got a weird receptacle like this. But remember, the rule still applies. Where is everything else attaching in relation to the ovaries? If they're below it, then it's a superior ovary. All right, let's talk about the fruit. Right? How we get from those structures that you just saw in the flower to what we get here. The fruits are going to be some sort of an aggregate. But what each of those separate little carpels forms into will vary depending on what kind of species you're talking about. It could be a follicle, like you see for the southern magnolia right here, where you have each one of those carpels form into a little follicle. Follicles are dehiscent fruits that open on only one suture, so they look like this. They kind of pop open like that. Or they could be berries, or in the case of the tulip tree, for example, down here, there's samaras, which are winged king. So these winged things right here are going to be the fruits that are formed, the samaras, and then they're sitting on this elongated receptacle that's inside here. So if we look at our fruit right here, this being from the southern magnolia, the one on the top right there, you can still see where all the parts used to be. Okay, so this is the flower, so all the parts used to be on here. We still have the carpels. Carpels up here, they've now formed into follicles. They're now formed into fruits. This region right down here kind of looks like a checker pattern, and that's going to be the scars of where the stamen used to be. So it went down to right about there. That region right there is the stamen. Then below that, you're going to have these kind of indentations that are kind of oval shaped. Those are going to be the scars of your tepals. So you'll be able to see the tepals where the petals are, even where the sepals are in relation to each other, because you're going to have some that are lower than the others. So take a look at the bottom of these so you can see how the flower used to be set up. This right here would be what? Below where the sepals and petals are. What would that be? Pedicel, exactly right. So this is your pedicel down here. So you got kind of all the parts of your flower here. The receptacle is what's left here. This portion right here and what these carpels are sitting on right here. So go ahead and see if you can see where all the parts of that flower used to be for that fruit. The seeds are oftentimes reddish color and fleshy. So up here you can see that for the southern magnolia, they're attached to little threads that kind of stick out of the little follicles. These, when you kind of squeeze them, they sort of smell like strawberries. They're not edible, don't eat them, right? But they smell kind of good. So they have that fleshy seed coat. So even though that is fleshy, that is in fact actually the seed coat. The fruit is the whole aggregate. Now, some of the native species around here, Tennessee examples, you've got your southern magnolia. We'll learn to identify this in the lab when we get into the tree walk. We'll get a chance to see that. It's one of the evergreen ones. So we've got one right outside of UPS that's planted there. Nice glossy leaves that are entire margins. Pretty easy to spot. And people plant it pretty regularly in their yards around here. Really, really big flowers, and it makes the fruit that you're passing around right now. And then you have your tulip tree, or your tulip poplar, or then tulip barrel, which we're going to get into later in the semester. The flowers look kind of tulip-like, which is where the name comes from. But you can still see those real obvious stamen in there. There's the laminar stamen on the inside. They have these kind of greenish yellow petal or tepals that have an orange spot at the base of them. And then each one of the carpels that's on their little receptacle right here forms into these individual samaras, sitting on a spiky receptacle. Other ones that you might find in Tennessee. Cucumber tree, less common. It's actually more common probably, I'd say, out east to the eastern Tennessee area. It doesn't generally occur in big clumps. When you find them, they tend to be kind of isolated solitary trees. They have slightly smaller leaves than the southern magnolia, and these are deciduous instead of evergreen. The flowers are smaller too, they're about that size, and they have yellow tepals instead of white ones. And the fruit is a nice green color, looks kind of like a cucumber when it comes up, and it's named cucumber tree. But it turns kind of a pinkish color when it actually matures, so they're kind of pretty. Have you ever seen cucumber trees?
I haven't.
Yeah, they're not real common around here, yeah. But you will find them in Tennessee, so. All right. Moving into our next group. So those are the only basal angiosperms that I'm gonna talk about.
Are you gonna post these lectures before the
Yes.
quiz?
Yes, definitely. I'm gonna post them, hopefully post them today. I have a meeting after this class, but I'll try and post it after the meeting, because I've got 1:30 to post. Alright, so we've been talking about basal angiosperms, which are the primitive ones. Now we're gonna get into one of the larger groups of angiosperms, one of the larger flowering plant groups. And in the diagram I'm gonna show you right now, these are the monocotyledons. They're economically and ecologically important. So if we look at our diagram, we just finished talking about this group, of which monocots used to belong to, but they don't anymore. Okay, this is the basal angiosperms. And then all the other plants are gonna be within these two groups right here. So this is one kind of individual lineage that branches off. It's sort of unique compared to all the ones that we're gonna see over here. And you can see there's an awful lot of shared derived traits that are related to them. And so now, since you keep having to key in the lab and figure out whether you got a monocot or a eudicot, this is gonna help you figure that out, okay? So we're gonna go through how do we recognize a monocot and how do we recognize a eudicot. All right, shared derived traits that monocots are gonna have. One, they're gonna have an interesting distribution to their vascular bundles. Their vascular tissue is gonna be organized a specific way within the ground tissue, and I'll show you that in just a second, which is gonna be different than how it's organized in eudicots. Now, if you remember way back when you took Biology 130, you actually have already seen this, because you had to draw cross sections of roots and stems in your Biology 130 plant lab. Does everyone remember doing that? That's what I'm getting at here. We're getting at those cross sections of the stems, and we're gonna come back to it. We're not gonna look at the roots, we're just gonna look at the stems for this. Number two, they actually don't have a vascular canopy. Their ancestor did, they have lost it. They've evolved over time not to have it anymore, which is going to limit their secondary growth capabilities. And we will discuss that as well. Number three, parallel leaf venation. So you can use the leaf venation to help you. And I'm not gonna say that there aren't any that don't have more netted venation, okay? But there are some that have evolved to have that kind of secondarily net look to them. It's different than what the eudicots do. But if you go back and trace the ancestors, they did have that parallel leaf venation initially. And they've just evolved to have some extra netting and net beyond that. But most of them are gonna have just parallel leaf venation. And their name comes from the fact that when the seed germinates and comes out of the seed coat, you're gonna have one cotyledon, one embryonic leaf that forms initially. You'll get more leaves after that, but you're only gonna have one that's a cotyledon, whereas eudicots are gonna have two. Okay, let's start with number one, our characteristic number one. How are these vascular bundles arranged? Okay. Well, vascular tissues in flowering plants are organized into these clusters or these bundles, right? Interconnected cells. We already know that tracheids and seed cells and things like that stack one on top of each other to make tubes, but then take several of those tubes and group them together into a bundle, and that's what we're talking about when we say vascular bundle. Okay, so we've got a bunch of little tubes that are all kind of clumped or grouped together here. If you do a cross-section of a monocot stem, what you'll find is that all throughout the ground tissue, because remember the ground tissue is the bulk of the plant, so all of this is ground tissue here, you find these vascular bundles just distributed throughout that entire area. Okay? The dermal tissue, which is the one of the other types of tissues in the plant, is going to be right on the edge of this, and of course the vascular tissue are the bundles that you see right here. Okay? So everything else is ground tissue. It's all dispersed throughout. When we get into the eudicots, it's going to be just around the edge in a ring. Nothing's going to be in here related to these vascular bundles. It looks really disorganized, but it's actually highly organized. There's a rhyme or reason to how that's organized. did they evolve this feature? That is actually not entirely clear as of yet. They have some hypotheses though as to why they may have evolved this. It may actually have been selective pressures for adapting for an aquatic habitat. Okay? That's one possibility as to why they started to have these distributed throughout the entire ground tissue. But when you evolve this kind of pattern, it sort of does mess with your capabilities of having that vascular cambium, which is an actual cylinder. Right? And it puts rings of secondary vascular tissue on the plant to add to the girth of the plant. Well, these are not in a ring. They're all scattered throughout, so you don't really have the capabilities of doing that anymore. There will be some plants that are monocots that can do secondary growth, but they do it in a very different way. They kind of add clumps or clusters in different places, or they do it through cell expansion. But in the case of most of these right here, you're not gonna find any sort of true wood in these monocots because they can't do that without the vascular cambium. That's where wood comes from. That's the secondary xylem. So if we cut a cross section of a palm tree, which is in fact actually a monocot, you can see there's nothing there. There are no rings like we see in something like a eudicot. This is from a yew tree right here. You got rings there. Each one of those rings represents a year of growth. It's representing things like our secondary xylem and our secondary flow, but we don't see that in the cross section of the monocot stems.
Is that why like the inside of some palm trees are edible, like sable palms?
Some of it's tender enough that you actually can eat it. Yes, it's not going to have that woody tissue, so yes, it's more tender for the reason. Yes, they still have some good stability though, and these are one of the ones that can have the other types of secondary growth, but it's not going to have those rings. But I have some fun stories about palm trees because they're near and dear to my heart. I grew up in South Carolina, so the state tree, South Carolina actually has a palm tree on it, because they were used for battle to build a fort, and they found that they were nice and spongy and bouncy, and so cannonballs just bounced right off of them, and so they were so effective at keeping the cannonballs away, they went ahead and put it on the flag. We'll talk about that one later on. So, all right, let's talk about the venation of the leaves. Most of them are going to have parallel venation. A couple of them also have something called penny parallel. It's kind of a more advanced version of parallel. That's where you have like a main rachis vein right here, and then all the side ones that come off are actually parallel to each other. So still not netted, okay? But so parallel, penny parallel is going to be the type of length venation you're going to find for most of these. So anything that has this like grasses falls in this category of being monocots. Now we also talked about when you're looking at your venation, make sure you're looking at the primary veins, because secondary veins can do different things. You can see they do have some ultimate veinlets here that are kind of transverse, that kind of cut across here, but the main ones all run parallel with each other in the entire distance of the leaf. And then we have our single-cod leaf, okay? Our first leafy-like structure that comes out of the seed. It's from the embryo. It is considered an embryonic leaf. Whereas eudicots are going to have two. Why one? We're not really sure. We're not really sure if there's any sort of adaptive significance to this having just one as opposed to something like two. Ouch. Sorry. That just sounded pretty good. All right, so let's compare them. Make sure we can really tell them apart here. Some of these features that I'm going to show you right here are in fact shared derived traits, or either the eudicots or the monocots, and so we can consider them defining features. A few of the other ones are characteristics that tend to work, but are not always consistently there. But it's still useful to know those, because that's the ones usually the key ends up using. So the first one obviously is the number of cotyledons. For eudicots, you've got 2. For monocots, you've got 1. We'll come back to this one in a second. For the leaf veins, you've got the netted venation for your eudicots. You've got the parallel venation for your monocots. Over here, we've got our vascular bundle distribution. This is what it looks like in the eudicots. Okay? It's a ring around the edge of the stem. There's nothing in the center portion of the ground tissue here, whereas for the monocot stems, you've got them distributed all throughout the ground tissue. Now, the other features, this one right here is actually gonna relate to a shared derived trait we're gonna talk about for the eudicots. It has to do with the number of pores or furrows, that means slits, that are in the pollen grain. Not a real useful characteristic in the field, because most of us are not gonna be looking at pollen grains in the field, but it is a shared derived trait for the eudicots to have 3 of those. And the advantage of that is it allows some more flexibility to the pollen grain in relation to humidity, so it can expand better in relation to humidity, but it also gives it more options on where that pollen tube is gonna come out, because that pore or that furrow is where it comes out. So we got 3 different places you can come out on a eudicot pollen grain, whereas on a monocot, it only has 1, that's it. That's where the pollen tube is gonna come out, so we have less options there. So we'll come back to that one again with the eudicots. The other one that I want to talk about is number of floral parts, because you've noticed that your key oftentimes says is the plant 3 meris, is the flower 4 or 5 meris. It's getting at this right here, and this feature. In the case of monocots, monocots usually are going to have their floral parts in multiples of 3. So for example, 3 sepals, 3 petals, 6 stamen, 3 carpels. That's essentially a lily is what I'm describing right there. That's a monocot. That would be all multiples of 3. All those 4 parts are multiples of 3. Versus something over here that would be a eudicot, that's going to be more likely to be in multiples of 4s or 5s. Right? And that's a feature I use pretty regularly when I'm trying to figure out whether I've got a monocot or eudicot.
What about being a monocot or eudicot makes it to where it's in groups of 4 or 5 or 3s?
What about them?
Yeah, like why specifically do monocots have it in groups of 3s and like
Well,
eudicots have it
it's
in groups
not
of 4s or
necessarily
5s?
consistent, because you used to have a term called dicot. You may have heard dicot before, as opposed to eudicot. That's an old term. You used to have dicots and monocots. Monocots are still what they are today. Those are the monocots. They have these shared derived traits that we're talking about right here. Dicots included all the eudicots plus all the basal angiosperms that kind of do their own thing. Right? And many of them are likely to have the features of eudicots, but they don't have the shared derived trait of eudicots that relates to the pollen grain. They are separate lineages. So in some ways, it's not necessarily something that's evolved specifically maybe for the monocots with the 3s, but not necessarily for the eudicots, because there's other groups of plants that have those 4 or 5 meris flowers. So I can't say it's something specifically they evolved, other ones have it too. Okay, here's our classification for monocots, and the ones that I've got circled here are the only ones that we're going to talk about. Some of them we will talk about more than one family, other ones we're only going to talk about one. All right, for the poales in particular, this will be a good group. I definitely actually want you to know this one, the poales, because we're going to talk about 3 different families in there, and they all look like grasses. Right? Only one of them is actually going to be the grass family, but all the rest of them are going to look like grasses too. Okay. And I try to, when I put these into Canvas for you, I actually try to, you notice the labelings I've got here? I try to label things. These are monocots, monocots, monocots. You'll know when we go into eudicots. I do want you to know which families are basal ones, which ones are monocots, which ones are eudicots, because it's going to help you with some of their characteristics as well. So these are the first 2 monocot families we're going to talk about, which is the arum family and the lily family. One we're probably more familiar with the other, but we're going to learn several species that are in the other one, the arum family, which is one of my favorites. So the arum family is going to be the one that we see over here on the left. Right? We're getting into this order right here, and then we'll dig into the liliales in a second. And its scientific name is going to be Araceae. Arum family Araceae. It's not a big family, about 104 genera, 3,300 species. Remember, you don't have to memorize the numbers. This is just to give you a comparison of sizes of families, because wait till we get into grasses. My least favorite family of all time. I cannot stand keying grasses. If you give me a grass in your collection, I'm going to cry. I will still key it out, but I will cry, because they are really hard to key. Right? I'm going to give you all grasses. I will typically say students generally get a little overconfident with their grasses because they don't realize how many of them are out there and how similar they look. And I two that actually identified them correctly, so. Risky, the good grasses in the collection, so, then we'll check it out. All right, so for the air family, we've got some terrestrial species. The two we're gonna learn are gonna be terrestrial. We've got aquatic species. A lot of them are aquatic, like this. And you can have pretty much every type of habit you can think of. You've got shrubs, you've got vines, you've got herbs, just not trees. Not everything is fescue. Hoa Angio is usually pretty safe one. That one's usually one people can get. And I've seen them give me a really cool one that they found over by the tennis courts called Hoa bulbosa. That it actually took 4 of us with PhDs to figure out what it was. I actually took it with me to the University of Georgia and I said, I know this isn't fescue, but what is this? And we all stared at this and could not figure out what we're looking at because the things that were on the top of the spikelets were not flowers and they weren't fruits. Turns out they were bulbs, hence the name bulbosa. They were asexual reproductive propagules. It took a graduate student to actually show us what it was, and they went to the herbarium and pulled out and like, I think I know what this is. That's what it is. So it's pretty cool. Turn around there, you might find it. All right, the leaves of Aeraceae are usually simple, but ironically enough, the two we're gonna learn have compound leaves. One of them's gonna have 3 leaflets associated with it, the other one's gonna have a whole bunch, and they all face on one side of the leaf itself, which makes it look kind of like a fan. But usually, generally speaking, within the family, they're usually simple. Basal or alternate. Ones we'll look at will have basal leaves, and usually only 1 or 2. And a sheathing at the base. Now, I will tell you, this feature right here is something that's pretty common for monocots, not consistent across the olive group, but we're gonna talk about grasses, we're gonna talk about sedges, we're gonna talk about orchids, we're gonna talk about rushes, we're gonna talk about these, we're gonna talk about lilies, we're gonna talk about amaryllis. They all have sheathing leaves. So if you see something with sheathing leaves, you could probably narrow it down, it's probably gonna be some sort of a monocot. This is their most distinctive characteristic, definitely one you wanna know for this one. It is their inflorescence, okay? Because everything in this family has a spadix as its inflorescence. Spadix, if you remember, are special types of spikes. They have a fleshy rachis, so the rachis is when the flower sits on. This part right here is fleshy and thickened, and oftentimes the flowers are too, kind of fleshy looking. And then you also will frequently have a special type of bract that kind of wraps around and covers that spadix. So the long sticky thing that you look at, the sticky thing right here that you see, that's the actual spadix. And some of them, that's all they have. They just have the spadix, which you can see right there. Other ones will have a spathe associated with them as kind of a decorative addition that is more for attracting pollinators to their location. The 2 we're gonna look at in lab are gonna have spathes, although their spathes are a little bit different. These are the flowers. Notice there's not really anything bolded on here because it's not necessarily a useful characteristic because the flowers are so doggone small. Sometimes it's actually hard to figure out what the individual flowers are. They can be bisexual, they can be unisexual, it depends on the species. They may have petals and sepals or not. If they do, they're in the form of tepals. So these weird looking fleshy things, they're yellow, those are actually the tepals. That's all that they are. And you can see some of the other ones, they don't have any of them all. Then we've got some of them that are kind of foul smelling because many of these plants use flies as their primary pollinators. So flies tend to be attracted to that yucky kind of rotting meat kind of smell, or rotten egg smell, and that's what they're coming to look at. And in the process, they'll pollinate the flowers. If they do have unisexual flowers, it's not uncommon for both flowers to be on the same spadix. Carpulate flowers in this picture you can see down here on the bottom, and then the staminate ones are on the top. And there's not a lot to them. So if we look, for example, at a close-up of these pictures of these flowers right here, you'll see that the male flowers essentially look like a weird stalk that have a bunch of little anthers sticking up off of them. That's it right there. That's the flower. Okay? No obvious tepals in this particular species. And then down here, the carpulate flower basically looks like just a carpel. Right? That's what it looks like. But it is in fact an actual flower. Now, you have multiple flowers here on this spadix. And each one of those flowers, especially the carpulate flowers, if they're unisexual, are capable of making a fruit. And that means you can have a fruit, the whole inflorescence become a fruit. And so that is what you typically get for things in this family. You're gonna usually have a multiple of berries. Because each each one of the flowers, whether they're bisexual or female, will form into a berry, but they're still on this spadix that you see right here, and that rachis, that fleshy rachis of the inflorescence. And so each one of the individual ones would be called berry, but the whole thing, which usually clusters together, would be considered a multiple. So a multiple fruit is formed from multiple flowers, not a single flower. Alright, so the ones we're going to see around here, we're going to be looking at things that are in the genus Eracema. We've got Jack in the pulpit, which is going to have compound leaves that have 3 leaflets, bright multiple fruit with bright red berries. It has the spadix in the center here that looks like it's standing in a green pulpit, hence the name Jack is the spadix in the pulpit, which is the spathe. And that spathe can be green, it can be purple, it can be green and purple striped. It's got some fancy coloration to it sometimes. And then you have my third personal favorite, the green dragon, Eracema, which has more of a very long, skinny spathe associated with this green. The spadix, though, is long and curves and kind of sticks out and narrows as it gets towards the tip. And somebody thought that looked like a dragon's tail. Not that anybody's ever seen a dragon before, but they thought it looked like a dragon's tail. But you can see when they're in fruit, they look super similar because they're both going to have those red berries and that multiple. And then the other one around here that you can find is something called Peltandra, green arrow arum. It loves wet habitats. So you're going to find this in wet marshy areas, freshwater places. It has calcium oxalate crystals in it, which is basically the main component of kidney stones. It's also the same thing that beer scale is. So not recommended to eat this. Native Americans did eat it, but you have to cook it for a very, 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 very long time before it's safe to eat. So I don't recommend it, but it definitely is a digestive issue. It can be fatal if you don't know what you're doing. So I don't recommend eating it for the calcium oxalate crystals. But it's going to have nice little arrow-shaped leaves, hence the name green arrow arum. And its spathe and spadix is kind of indescript and small, but it has a green spathe that surrounds the spadix, kind of wraps around it. It looks like a pea, but that's actually the inflorescence, not the fruit. All right, we'll stop here for today, and I hope everybody has a